we'll have together with Loren Shoenberg. It's remarkable. Loren came to us really through Stanford Live. So I'd like to give a quick thanks to him. For years, as I understand. Ben Frenzel introduced this idea to me. Laura Evans really was excited and thrilled about connections between art and jazz. And Ryan Davis did much of the coordinating and organization of today's talk. So thanks to everybody there. And we're thrilled to have Loren. Many of you probably know Loren through some of these past programs. You know that for about 13 years, I believe, he's been the artistic director of the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, New York. He hails from New York. He's been a faculty member at the Juilliard School, the New School, the Manhattan School of Music, William Patterson University, Long Island University, and the Hart School. In addition, he's lectured at the Museum of Modern Art, the Met, the White House, New York Philharmonic. I mean, Loren is everywhere. He's also really tied in with the Smithsonian and the Jazz Masterworks Orchestra, the American Jazz Orchestra, and the Westdeutscher Rundfunk Jazz Orchestra in Cologne, Germany. Loren is a tenor saxophonist and a pianist, which I think is really something that we should all recognize. He's a scholar and a historian, but he's also an artist. And he's played with Benny Carter and recorded with Benny Goodman and many, many other people, Christian McBride, Buck Clayton. And he was the musical director for Bobby Short from 1997 to 2005. He also received 2 Grammy Awards for Best Album Notes in 94 and 2004. And he oversaw the Benny Goodman archives at Yale University, where he produced a 10-CD release of previously unissued Goodman recordings. On top of all that, he's taught for several jazz at Lincoln Center educational programs and published widely, and it's just really a remarkable opportunity for us at the Anderson Collection at Stanford University to have Loren Shoenberg joining us. So please, come on up. Thank you, sir. You want and maybe what I will just say is that today's presentation is going to be an improvisational, jazz-inspired, call and response conversation experiment. So please join us in this sort of free-form conversation. And we encourage you all to join in sort of, in the conversation as well. So give us a chance to start, and then we'll see what happens. Do you want?
Actually, that's fine, yeah. No.
Yeah? Okay.
No more sound.
Great.
All right, let's see if you can do it today. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Okay, very good. Very good. All right. I was really intrigued. Well, I just want to say, by way of starting, that I really know nothing about this stuff. I know about it like most lay people know about it. What I do know about is jazz, and this phenomenal museum and this phenomenal collection. I was just overwhelmed. The Cantor I knew well because I've been doing programs there for many years, but I heard about the gestation of this place, especially from its architect, Richard Olcott. But when I came here and saw it, I have to say I was just absolutely bowled over, and the thought that a collection like this great collection is going to have a finite home for for posterity. Is so vitally important. And I know that what we're doing at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem is we're on the same path. We're trying to do the same thing. You've already done it. And what a wonderful place. My aunt and uncle live near Berkeley, and he's well into his 80s. We had dinner the other night, and I told him that I was giving this lecture here. And lo and behold, their idea of a vacation, they just did it last weekend. They come down from there, stay in a hotel down here, and spend the weekend here. And they knew every room. They knew this room. They said there's a horse or something. And so, anyway, that's the personal collection. When we sang, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing, and we all kind of felt it. You all felt something, huh? And the barriers went down, and our hearts beat a little faster, maybe a little endorphin rush, and we sang a jazz song. The artists that we're going to talk about today, mainly Jackson Pollock and the others, all had jazz as a common denominator. And I think it's largely misunderstood, the effect that jazz had on them. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about it from a jazz perspective, and I'm just really interested in hearing it from the perspective of fine art. This quote from Kevin Kline was, I'm kidding, Franz Klein, was, just wanted to see if you're listening. Humor is a big part of music, right? The final test of a painting, theirs, mine, and any other, is does the painter's emotion come across? And in the performance of jazz, specifically, that's something that's very important, because no two jazz performances are alike. They can't be. A, because the music is coming out spontaneously, although it's based on very strict things, and B, and this is where this comes into it, and everyone who's at this wonderful museum, which is that it's the reaction of the audience. Now that just sounds like so much talk to pander to an audience, but it's really true in jazz. We play you. We play the audience. Your vibration, the atmosphere, the metaphysics of it, it affects what's done on the bandstand that time. And so that's why I was really intrigued by these artists and about action painting and about all this. So my first question or comment is that what these people did, was it that radically different from everything that preceded it, or is it like other art forms where you can go back and say Goya was doing this, or Van Gogh was layering like this, or, I mean, is what we think about action painting totally unique?
It was. It was a movement that happened in New York City, and I think a lot of the reason for it happening was because of the place in which it lived. I think the artists were, very open and interested in things that were happening around them, like jazz, like theater, like poetry. And there was this amalgamation of artistic individuals sort of boiling in the post-war years in New York City. And this group of artists who came to be known as the abstract expressionists or the action painters, people like Franz Klein and Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning, were really doing all that they could to make sure that their touch in that moment was unique and fresh, that they were really looking to find ways to express themselves through abstraction, to really remove themselves from the representational sort of histories of American painting or European painting. I think we should remember that really the center of contemporary art in the world was not New York, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. It was in Europe, in Paris. And with these sort of giants, these were mostly men, they were mostly these sort of impassioned, powerful, very kind of directly inspired individuals. And they felt that they, even though they were working together as a group, each wanted to present and create his own moment and his own expression. And so, some of the things are, Pollock really, he broke free what had been painting before. All these artists expanded the size that they were working on. They got away from working traditionally on an easel, right? They worked large scale. Pollock worked on the floor. Franz Klein made these huge canvases that, he had to really embody physically. And so it was this physicality that these artists put into the making of these works that really, I think, brought them attention.
But is it fair also to say, though, that there's something, especially with Franz Klein born here, Jackson Pollock born here, Ghali born here, that there's something intensely American about what they did. And I think that that's part of what they found succor for in jazz. These, maybe you could just briefly just tell everyone what we're looking at.
Yeah, sure. On your left is Willem de Kooning's Woman Standing Pink from about 1954, 1955. All these works are here in the Anderson collection at Stanford. De Kooning created a series of woman paintings, some of which you're probably familiar with in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And this painting followed sort of a group of 3 or 4 others that just preceded it. All of these woman paintings were done by de Kooning in a studio, but over a lot of time. I mean, he really spent time working with these. I think we think about jazz, at least as we're talking about this conversation, as being very improvisational in the moment of and the action of creating and painting. But in de Kooning's case, he actually, even though this wild brushstroke and there's all this gesture in the application of the paint to the canvas, he still was very deliberate in his process, and I think that that's something that is important to think about. Franz Klein, this is figure 8 from 1952. Again, just a seminal work. If you see it in person, you know how big it is. It's really, human scaled, over human scaled. And these big swaths of paint that are applied by Klein were done with a large brush and were really gesturally applied. And there's a great quote from Klein that relates to jazz that I just found, and I just wanted to point out. Hope I'm not jumping the bandwagon here, but Klein says, he says, "I'll answer you the same way Louis Armstrong does when they ask him what it means when he blows his trumpet. Louis says, 'Brother, if you don't get it, there's no way I can tell you.'" So this is, in terms of looking at his work, a way that he's approached that. And then Adolf Gottlieb's Transfiguration 3 from 1958 is on the right. And again, it's a seminal work that really came out of not a true series, but a group of paintings that Gottlieb explored in his mature years, that in a way in which he was sort of compartmentalizing his canvas, the upper portion always being this sort of explosive but heavenly, soft-edged object, kind of hovering above this much more syncopated, lyrical, kind of wild application of medium. And the contrast of color, I think, in Gottlieb is something that we should think about too. Klein is very much black and white at this point, but I think, this balance of color and form, soft and hard, thin and thick, is something that's really indicative of these artists' works.
So next we go to a painting that's here that I assume it's one of the real treasures of the entire world.
Yeah.
Am I correct? I just read it on your website, so you probably wrote it, but...
Everything there is true.
Okay. That this was in the Andersons' house for decades and decades and decades, and it's one of the great works of all time. And one of the things that I learned from reading what you had about it was, and again, this is just a reproduction, we can all go and see it, are those little points of red. Very small, but very profound and very spiky. Here come the adjectives, right? It's lunchtime, so they're usually food adjectives. Spicy. But this brings us into the world of Jackson Pollock. And before we do that, could you give us a short summary just of why this is so important?
Sure, yeah. I mean, as you mentioned, Pollock was born in America, but he came to New York in 1930 from the West Coast. And he then moved from New York City to East Hampton, to what I guess is Long Island. And, sort of as a way to get away from the wildness and the craziness and the carousing that he was doing with his friends at the Cedar Tavern in New York City, and the drinking and everything. He wasn't successful in avoiding any of that, but he did end up in the Springs. And at that time, so this is in the mid to late 1940s, his painting style really was transformed. And in 1947, Pollock really sort of catapulted himself to worldwide attention by creating these paintings using this dripped technique, right? Where he's, again, as I mentioned briefly earlier, he's coming to this painting from a completely personal perspective. He's totally uninterested in what other people are doing as far as painting. He is uninterested in how things happened before. He was very much influenced by surrealism earlier, and maybe some of those thought patterns, maybe some of those sort of dream-induced philosophies of surrealism are still present here. But what he's done is he's taken his canvas off this easel, he's dropped it onto the floor, he's moving around, he's painting, actively around this thing. And in 1946 and 47, he starts this, and he just opens up the world's possibility for what a painting can be. And Lucifer was included in the first exhibition of these drip paintings in New York in January of 1948 at the Betty Parsons Gallery. And Lucifer was just a seminal piece. It ended up staying with Pollock. He kept it for a few years, struggling with his alcoholism and other things. He traded it to a man that was helping him sort of cure his illnesses. And it remained in that personal collection for many years before ultimately being purchased by some gallerists and a great collector who had it for a couple of years and from whom the Andersons were able to acquire it, but only after 2 years or more of them really knocking on Joe Hazen's door asking for permission to maybe have this object join their home, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And it's incredible condition too, which is I think a special thing about it.
Yeah. Well, next we go to a quote from a perfectly respectable piece by someone who I don't know, but it was someone who was associated with Yale University. I don't know if she was a student or a professor there. And I was reading this, and it's very, very interesting. And there's a couple of points that I just want to make in it. I gave a talk at I guess it's called the Krasner House in Long Island. Yes, the Pollock Krasner House. And so I started reading more and more about his interest in jazz. And as we're going to find out, one of the main connections between Jackson Pollock and jazz is that one of his paintings was famously used on the cover of a breakthrough avant-garde jazz record of 1960-61 called Ornette Coleman Free Jazz. So I always assumed that Jackson Pollock's love of jazz had to do with avant-garde music or modern jazz music. But there are great quotes here. Lee Krasner once remarked that Pollock would get into grooves of listening to his jazz records not just for day and night for 3 days running until you thought you would climb the roof. Jazz, he thought it was the only other really creative thing that was happening in this country. And then it goes on, and then the writer makes an analogy between the music of John Coltrane and again some of the more very modern extended music that's still challenging to listen to, but let's not forget that the music of Loren Shoenberg is still challenging to listen to, and no relative, but so and also one thing I learned in the Krasner House was that when he died, I believe, she got rid of his jazz records in a second. It was like they took him down to the bin, did not want to hear jazz anymore. But anyway, I just raise this as what we usually read, and it's interesting and true. However, my investigations have found out I make the case that actually Pollock, based on his record collection, which there is a list, was not really much interested in modern jazz at all. His love of jazz came from the early traditional jazz. But the early traditional jazz is actually much more, quote unquote, modern and progressive than what we call the avant-garde progressive jazz. It was much more of a leap at the time. Maybe in the sense that Pollock's Lucifer and paintings like that are a huge leap, and no matter who follows in his wake, that's one thing that they can't do. They can't make that leap. Then they can stay over where he leaped to and make their own leaps. But that initial leap is something that is unique. So here we go to, on the left, the first great jazz band that was recorded and out of which came Louis Armstrong. And that is King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. And on the left is how you would have seen them playing, actually that's in San Francisco, 1921, 1922. If you didn't see them in a nightclub, you would see them in a vaudeville theater. And they were dressed in their antebellum outfits or just playing up all that stuff. On the right is how they actually appeared when they played in venues that they preferred to play in. And the important thing is you can just tell from looking at it, these were, and we know from interviews, these were self-conscious artists who knew that they were doing something new, who were very, very much aware, and no matter how much noble savagism and patronizing attitudes that we put on that generation of early jazz people, the truth is the great majority of them were musically educated, wrote music, read music, and again, the thing that comes out in interviews with these people, not just Armstrong, that's Armstrong, you can see he's third from your right, but from the others too, specifically the second from the right, Johnny Dodds, and his brother on left, Baby Dodds, is that they, just to repeat what I said, they knew what they were doing was profound. They knew it was something new. And they had the same self-consciousness that jazz artists of today. They invented that, which is this unique intersection between race, music, culture that can only happen in America because jazz didn't happen in Africa and it didn't happen in Europe. It happened here. My question would be, is the same thing true with abstract expressions, even with Hans Hofmann and people like that, and the profound influence of all these European painters? Could it have only happened here, or is that an overstatement?
No, I mean, it appears so. I mean, and I think that the post-war years were special.
Right.
I think that, you know, these artists, many of whom were immigrants, Bakunin was an immigrant, right?
Right.
But he came to America not imagining that he'd be a great painter, but with artistic background.
Right.
But I think that this melting pot that is America, this cross connections of cultures who are all, especially in New York City, you know, struggling and pushing the boundaries for whatever they do, you know, finding industry jobs, creating businesses, you know, quote unquote entrepreneurship and that type of thing. Innovation was just happening, and so I think that that helped create an environment in which these artists who were young men and who were really looking to who thought they were doing something special and who ultimately were doing something special. They were in this environment that really, I think, helped boil that up.
In the center is a photo of Ornette Coleman himself, who is very much alive. He's in his 80s. He lives in New York City. And he is also a living statement of abstraction and of irony and of... I'll talk while it's playing, and forgive me, Ornette. Because this music was on the album with the Pollock painting, people naturally looked at the painting and looked to hear the music, or listened to the music and looked to hear the painting. There was a definite correlation, and it kind of works. But I'm going to just fast forward this. This is the music that he actually listened to. He didn't listen to this stuff in his studio. This is what he listened to. I have a nice crossfade, but I'm going to fast forward it. Louder. Okay. That was a total accident. Let me make the case that because we heard that music that you just heard in Leon Fleischer cartoons of the 1930s and 40s and 50s and the cat chasing or something, we associate with it because we've been conditioned to associate that music with a certain kind of thing. For my generation, cartoons, probably for yours too, and it's hard to disassociate it from that association. But I will tell you that that music is more modern and was more of a leap in terms of how wide that leap was from what came before, and is more profoundly influential than even the self-consciously music of the avant-garde. It's hard to get to that point, but that's the truth. Now, as we progress and start looking at a painting like this, my question would be, if you were to look at this from the angle of precedent. Now, we said nobody else had done stuff, but we know that when we listen to, you know, if I were to narrow down some some measures of Johann Sebastian Bach's Goldberg variations, and I do this on that, just narrow down this little corner of it, and said you were listening to atonal music from Europe from the 1920s, you would say absolutely yes. Because there are moments in the Goldberg variation that are just, I mean, you remember Woody Allen's famous impersonation of Picasso was this? Remember that? Okay, but you know, the music is somewhat like that. Now my question is, are there elements in here that you can look at and isolate and say were found in previous artists' work? Shapes or thoughts or concepts?
I mean, there's a whole history of painting that Pollock, in this case, was aware of, right? I mean, he started as a young man painting in a very representational style.
Right.
Thomas Hart Benton is this regionalist painter from the 20s and 30s. You're familiar with his work as murals and very sort of New Deal era regionalism, murals in post offices, etc. And Pollock was as a young man, Pollock was a student of Benton's and was very influenced by Benton.
Oh, really?
He since says, I don't know, I didn't learn anything from Benton. But if you look at early Pollock paintings, you can't help but see that in his work, right? And then obviously Picasso and all the other European greats were in the mind of Pollock and these other artists.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, you said you can't help but see it in his work. Help us see it in his work. I mean,
in the earlier works, for sure.
In the earlier works.
And so I think getting to this point, I think there's no way that his past experiences aren't still somehow illustrated
Right.
here. But to be able to, cordon off the square and say, there's,
No, of course
Picasso,
not.
there's Pollock, there's...
But in terms of intent or aesthetic, maybe...
It's hard to say. I mean,
Right.
I think probably the biggest influence on these works really was Pollock's interest in surrealism and this sort of the notion of the surrealists to free associate and to respond to their dreams or to be very sort of connected to the creation of what they are, but in a sort of unconscious way. So I think the unconsciousness of Pollock's process, dropping this paint, not controlling the application of it onto the canvas
Right.
with the brush touching it, but letting chance fall in. I think that mostly comes from the surrealists.
Yeah.
But from an aesthetic perspective, do we see it? Not exactly.
Okay. Next we go to something very, very interesting. On the left is an early self-portrait of Pollock's. And
And I think Benton
Okay.
maybe is illustrated here in a way. Right?
well, see, I have no idea. The only thing that, again, in my very limited experience was that in some weird way it reminds me of some of the Kandinsky Schoenberg self-portraits with the eyes and all that kind of weird, excuse the word weird, but unusual things. That's how it rhymes for a real lay person. The reason that I mention it is that I did see on the internet early sketches of Pollock's where he's a wonderful, seems to be like, what's the word, draftsman or whatever. I mean, boy, he does a body really well, in the face and he really could do it. And so the perception from people who don't know much about abstract art or abstract expression is, he was there with the paint can, he was just kind of going like this. And it's like a comedy piece that people do, right? In other words, this is what they were doing. Well, of course, that's not true. He studied hard, he studied with Benton, he knew all these things, and what he did was an informed choice done out of someone with the requisite technique to satisfy all the conventions of the time. Now, here we have a lead sheet of written down music that Louis Armstrong wrote in his early 20s, sent to Washington, D.C. from New Orleans to the Copyright Office to get his copyright. So the whole idea that these early jazz artists were just kind of, again, this noble savagism, which is still alive in politics, but just think about how they treat Obama, but that's a whole other story. But this whole thing about noble savagism, that Louis just stood up. There's a clip, and I don't mean to damn with faint praise, but Leonard Bernstein, who did so much for music education, was so wonderful. Even he was part of it. There's a well-known clip of Louis Armstrong with a symphony orchestra conducted by Bernstein, and they do the St. Louis Blues, and it's in many documentaries. And at the end, Bernstein, who knew exactly how brilliant Armstrong, goes up to him, puts his arm around him and says something to the effect of, "This simple man." And it's almost like he's saying, if he could only talk, you must go back to your people. That attitude is there, and unfortunately it's still there with jazz music, and in an analogous way, but in a different way. It's that way with abstract expressionism, where people don't realize that people like Pollock were extraordinarily talented. So this is why I have these two images here, is to destroy the canard that somehow these people didn't know what they were doing, or that it was just natural and it just happened. This record, this thing right here, includes written down part of the solo that we think Armstrong just improvised. So what the jazz musician does is, in the same way that the painter does, day to day editing, thinking, composing, subtracting, adding to what they do. And so then when they do the spontaneous thing, it's informed by all those thousands of hours of decision making internally.
And that's exactly consistent with with Willem de Kooning's painting technique, and Frans Klein's painting technique. I mean, if you go up and look at the Klein figure 8, the big black and white piece, I mean, I think we look at it and it seems very spontaneous.
Yeah, right.
And you see elements of drips, and you see overlap of black on white and white on black. But that didn't just happen in the moment. As Louis Armstrong is penning his notes, Klein is also doing preparatory sketches, drawings. He's filling out areas on his canvas. He's sort of sketching out a structure on his canvas on which to paint. That's not necessarily the case with Pollock, but I think again with Pollock, strip painting Lucifer as an example, and many others, if you look closely at the ground, the canvas of Lucifer, you'll see marks that are not consistent with drips. And so there are these sort of grayed areas on the back that Pollock laid down, likely with a brush, to sort of set a structure on the canvas on which to then improvise. So there's this back and forth.
Well, I'm not sure if it was Pollock, but I read one of these folks, I believe that, now they x-ray canvases and they can see that, Rembrandt was originally painting a horse or something and all that kind of stuff. I think it was Pollock or one of them that they did the x-ray thing, and they found out that there was some pre-laying out of areas and or thoughts.
Sure, that definitely happens. I mean, and with de Kooning too, I mean, he would paint, Woman Standing Pink was painted not in a day, not in 2 days, not in 3 days. The date range is actually a year. And he would come back to these things, and he would add medium to his paint to slow the drying of the oils, right? And he would work wet on wet. He would also cover up his canvases at night with newsprint, so to slow the drying process. And so in some cases you see that newsprint remained, and he liked it, he left it. Other times he intentionally put it there. But I guess, like with these jazz musicians, they're going back into their work to build upon it and to really expand their expressive opportunities.
There's a wonderful book that I think is back in print called Notes of a Hanging Judge by Stanley Crouch. And in it, in an essay that he wrote called Red Beans in the Renaissance, about his first trip to Italy when he encountered Giotto and all those people for the first time, he writes about that there could be a new area of brain research because, and actually there is now at Johns Hopkins, there's a Dr. Lamb and a few other people who are doing this thing of trying to study what happens when they play jazz or when you're spontaneous. And what Stanley says in the book, which is a wonderful book to read, is that jazz is somehow making sense of the moment. And that we tend to retroactively try and understand history and all these things and try and codify it. But what the jazz really represents, and maybe what we could say the abstract expressionists represent, or these ones, really represent is somehow giving form to the moment. And not the thought that something spontaneous is just like throwing the paint on the painting, and that was the moment, but somehow it's ordering what we do. Now, that's enough for a week seminar right there, of which I would need 15 people to explain to me what the hell I just said. But it's food for thought. It's food for thought. Yeah. Let me play you a little example here of a musical demonstration of what we're talking about. Now, this is from the same recording that we listened to before. It's called The Snake Rag, and it was played by King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band in 1923. And listen to it, and then I'll tell you, I'll share something with you. Listen carefully. Right here. It happens again. Why can't you laugh when you look at abstract art? You should laugh, right? There should be joy in it. Jazz has become like art in some ways, of like, now listen. Now, what you just heard was they're improvising, right? There's 4 or 5 instruments, and they're playing at the same time. Do you have any idea how difficult that is? I will tell you that 99 out of the brilliant young guy, jazz, and I say guys because there is a lot of misogyny in jazz, but that's for another time, that 99 out of 100 young jazz musicians can't do that. Now, they may be taught to condescend to that kind of music. Oh yeah, that's like, again, like painting a bison on a wall or something like that. But that is an extraordinarily hard discipline. To play 4 or 5 instruments at the same time and not step on one another and not play the same note and not contradict each other. It's like Johann Sebastian Bach as Siamese quintuplets. There's a good first line of a short story. Okay.
Did these musicians, I'm just thinking about the collaborations or the partnerships or the lack thereof with these abstract expressionist artists. I mean, these guys would visit each other's studio, but mainly when they're creating in their own space.
Yes.
With their singular focus. They go out at night, they go to the Cedar Tavern, they go to the 5 Spot, I think, to listen to jazz. And so they carouse together. But really, in the moment of creation, they're doing their own thing. But it sounds like there's much more collaboration in the jazz world.
And that's why, and I'll just say that these recordings are from the 20s from Chicago. These were the bedrock foundations that inspired them to become jazz fans, that then they went out later years and knew the musicians who knew this stuff. But there's another wonderful book by Albert Murray called Stompin' the Blues, and some things by Ralph Ellison that I would strongly advise you read. In a sense, what you're hearing with the jazz musicians is the best demonstration of what being a good citizen is, and what the potential is for being, if there were a democracy and not an oligarchy or a plutocracy, but if it actually was going to be a democracy at some point, that what the potential was for a citizen to be. The way that just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, and your responsibilities as a good member of a community. And people have written, I'm just spitting back things that I have read from Albert Murray and Ralph Ellison and others who've written profoundly about this. Another wonderful author's name is John Calvinhoven, who wrote a book called Beer Can by the Highway. He taught at Columbia for many years. These are basic texts that don't take on, for the most part, abstract expressionism. Only person who really did that was Alfred Appel, who taught at Northwestern for many years, and I believe Ben was one of his students. Well, anyway, what's the point about that clip I played? You heard them all playing, right? Ba 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 ba, and then all of a sudden the 2 trumpets went like wah ba ba, all and together. Now, you might say that's a seeming contradiction. I thought you told me that this music was improvised, and they're up there spontaneously doing this. Well, then how did they play the same thing at the same moment? This was a trick that all the musicians came to hear King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band do. How did Louis know, because he played the cornet, as did King Oliver, when that break came, how did he know what to play? And how did he know to play it in harmony? And it was different every time, so it couldn't have been arranged. Well, before he died, Louis gave the answer to that mystery, which was that while they were playing the beginning part, which I'll play you here, in the midst of all this, in the midst of all that, King Oliver would look at Louis and play one little phrase in the midst of the jumble, and just kind of go like, and then 4 seconds later, when they got to the break, Louis, being so quick, would make up a harmony part to that little phrase and play it. It's like Ricky Jay, you know what I mean? It's a suspension of disbelief. You know what I mean? So that's part of what this is. To go to the final examples here, to try and listen to some music. I have no idea what this is. No, I'm kidding. No, but can you help us understand? Because I mean, where is Pollock in relation to Picasso? I know that that's a book in and of itself, but simply for a layperson.
I mean, I think both are equally inventive, right? I mean, I think both created something that nobody else had done before. I think both took in influences that they were able to sort of make their own expressions out of. I mean, I think they're hard to compare, you know, sort of aesthetically, I think. I mean, this painting for me, this Picasso painting for me, I think this is the one that's in New York's MoMA.
Probably.
It's a remarkable painting. I mean, just personally, I studied art history, but as a kid, you know, I had the opportunity to go to MoMA and see this painting. And I mean, it's great that you're showing it. I didn't think about it in connection to this talk, but it's absolutely perfect, right?
Well, it's music and it's art, so it's, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's a remarkable thing, and I think it really moved me when I saw it. And I think that, you know, one thing that people can say about Pollock, as they say about Picasso or Picasso's Guernica or these other major things that, you know, that were monumental in their impact. I mean, I think Pollock was also monumental in his impact. Some people might look at this and think it's beautiful or be able to relate specifically to the figurative elements of it and come away feeling really positive. Others, you know, might feel differently. But I think with Pollock, you know, some of us look at these strip paintings and maybe we don't immediately relate to them like we might be looking at this. And so I think that some people say, look, Pollock could do that, my kid could do that, what's so special, what's so unique about it? But your kid couldn't do it.
Excuse me.
But what's important is that Pollock sort of did it first, right? And really had ownership around the importance of it, you know, and maybe that's, you know, a big-headed idea. But I think Picasso, too, knew that what he was doing was influential.
And I was also thinking that, from something that you just said, actually, which is that, I mean, Picasso became an iconic figure on the planet. Mm-hmm. Now just think about that. He became an iconic figure, one of the most well-known names on the planet, doing abstraction. Mm-hmm. And Louis Armstrong. It's one way to think of Louis Armstrong and those early great jazz musicians. They are doing what they're doing is a basic a basic tenet of abstraction. If you look at the library, at the dictionary definition, what jazz does is to abstract something. It takes the popular music or the cultural conventions of a time and it does a Picasso on it. It's basically what it does. It turns it inside out, upside down, changes the perspective, and Pollock, I guess, also, to a lesser degree than them, but has also become an iconic figure. Sure. Much more than Franz Klein and much more than Hans Hofmann and all those people.
And some of that comes with the cult of personality, right?
Right.
He killed himself, he killed somebody else by crashing, you know, I mean, as a relatively young man.
Do you think that that played a role in his iconic status, like with James Dean or something? Or?
I think so,
Yeah.
I think so too. I mean, I think we could only imagine what might have come out of it. Maybe he wouldn't have been forgotten, or maybe he wouldn't have been as thought of as highly, because, you know, he reached this incredible pinnacle of invention, and then he was gone, right? And maybe he could have sustained that, maybe it wouldn't have mattered whether he did or not. But I think there's something about that.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think you brought up Ornette Coleman and the free jazz, and the painting that's on the cover of that album is White Light from, I think, 1954. But that album didn't come out until 1960.
He was gone, right?
And Pollock was dead by then, right? So it was in the thinking and in the minds of Ornette Coleman, at least, at that point, right? Already.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to play for you just a couple, just to underline my point about earlier forms of jazz having very abstract moments in them by isolating a moment. And again, it's like, again, you know, if we were to isolate one little corner like you might do in a class and just say, you know, that looks like, and then you do your projection onto, you know, onto whatever you think it looks like. But this is a recording that Louis Armstrong did in 1928 called Weatherbird. And it was a duet with the brilliant pianist Earl Hines. And we're not going to listen to the whole recording, but I'll just give you a flavor of it. Question for you. maybe because I'm a jazz fan, but I mean, doesn't that record make you want to tap your toes?
I was.
Or shake your booty? I mean, it does. And what, do you want people who look at a Jackson Pollock painting to have the same reaction? I mean,
Yeah, I think
not that specific one, but some kind of kinetic thing, and was that something that these artists wanted more than looking at a fish and a lemon and a plate, which is wonderful too, but that they wanted, gosh, they just wanted people to somehow bounce, or is that too naive a thought?
No, I think some of them very much had that desire. I mean, Rothko, we haven't talked about Rothko, but you know, maybe he didn't want you to bounce, but he wanted you to really sort of be absorbed, right? I mean, he wanted you to have a physical, emotional reaction to seeing that work or to listening to the jazz piece, you know, in a similar way. I have this quote, and I'm glad you led me to it, but this is Jackson Pollock saying, essentially, you know, in talking about his work, he's saying, I think it should be enjoyed, just as music is enjoyed. So, I mean, I think from his perspective specifically, he wanted you to really enjoy it. He wanted you to have, an experience with it.
And hopefully to laugh. And to find the joy and the humor in it, because what kind of art, and jazz has suffered from this, I will say, European-induced malady, which I could explain why, but this thing of that, you know, that when we go to a concert hall, I mean, poor Oliver Sacks is ill. I don't know if you know that, if you've read Dr. Oliver Sacks, who's been writing some things, but you know, he's written wonderful books, Musicophilia and things like that, about the strange, I don't know if it's called psychodrama, but it also exists. It exists in jazz clubs, it exists in the concert hall, and it exists in the museums. All these places of certain kind of art where people are forced into a certain kind of behavior that has nothing to do with the thing that they're doing. Like, I would ask you that question. If I go to hear a Brahms symphony, I've always wanted to do this. Maybe I'll do it someday. You know, I mean, there's a lot of hilarious things. There's a lot of hilarious things in Beethoven. And just at that moment, stand up and start laughing. Or point at the bass drum and go on, that's fun, do it again, do it again. Now, you know what happened. I'd be frog marched right out of there. And as silly an example as that, just think about it. Think about it.
You can do it here.
Okay, right. See, I was hoping you'd say that. But in jazz, too, it's become like that for the most part. Most clubs, most concerts, they're very serious events. And you rarely will see someone laugh, or much less laugh out loud or poke the person next to them. I say, what happens to an art form when it's shorn of all those things? Jesus, I mean, my God, I mean, it's a horrible thing, you know? So, now, let me play you one little excerpt from that recording of Weatherbird, where I took something that Earl Hines played, in which to me it sounds like a Jackson Pollock painting looks. All right. See what I mean? Yeah. You can take elements of this recording, which is thought to be, again, unfortunately the way it's taught, and again, I'm just on a soapbox here, you know, again, the way that most of this stuff is approached in the academy, or even in the Jazz Academy, is, again, isn't it amazing? The caveman painted a bison on the wall, you know, with his, you know, hoof, you know, all this kind of stuff. And that's how this early stuff is looked at. It's never thought to be like a Jackson Pollock painting, or something like that, and it's just as abstract. Here's another element of jazz abstraction from a student of that music. Now, this is someone who Pollock did know and was around in these people. This is Thelonious Monk, who again is misunderstood in many ways. I would recommend a film. It was Clint Eastwood atoning for his sins of a movie called Bird about Charlie Parker, which is a very well-intentioned film, but it's a horrible film from the jazz historical perspective, because it takes a great African-American genius and has to turn him into an infantilize or whatever it is. They have to turn him into some kind of like, again, some noble savage who doesn't really know what he's doing, but boy, when he plays that saxophone. And anybody who knew Charlie Parker knew he was an intellectual, he was a very bright guy and all this kind of stuff. Now, here's a tune in how you would originally have heard it when it was written. And it's a beautiful version, but just listen to it. This is Tommy Dorsey's band. It's beautiful, actually, isn't it? Want to dance? No, I'm kidding. Okay. I love this stuff, boy. Some ancestor of mine is coming through saying, the young people don't have music like that. What are they going to dance to? You know. But anyway, all right, now. So there's that song, and that's how that song was written and played. It is gorgeous. But it's sentimental, and it's beautiful, and it's all those things. Now here's Thelonious Monk taking the same tune, and again, I want you to think of a Jackson Pollock painting like this one, you know, and see if you can find some intersection between what he does to it. Now, I'm going to tell you that this is an originally unissued version of him playing that song, and he began by rehearsing a little bit. So what you're going to see is, in a sense, it would be like Jackson Pollock maybe looking at some crazy thing he had just done with the paint, you know, with his can and his thing, and saying, you know, I like that. I like that. I'm gonna, because his works are full of motifs and develop things. So it's okay. I'm gonna do that here because he's reacting to what he just did. You'll hear Monk here practice an introduction that would seem like he just went like bleh. And here he is rehearsing it, but then he goes into the tune, and then you can compare it with the Tommy Dorsey version. Oh, shucks. I thought I could listen to the music and look at another painting. I can't. Okay. See, it sounds like wrong notes, right? Of course, they're not wrong notes. They're the beautiful accidents, but they're not even accidents. But he let them become accidents, if you know what I'm saying. Yeah.
Do you close your eyes when you listen to music?
When I really listen, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you might want to close your eyes. I mean, I always close my eyes when I listen to music, you know.
How about in museums? It's one difference.
Well, it would be nice to touch a Van Gogh.
Sure.
And there's a good joke there I won't make. It's not politically correct. So what I'm saying is the emotion or the aesthetic, whatever you want to call it, the world that this inhabits, as opposed to the as compared to the conventional jazz of its day, is as different from that as the Pollock is from Norman Rockwell or something, you know? Yeah. It's 1 o'clock.
Yeah, how are we doing on time?
Do we have...
I think we should...
It's 1 o'clock. But do we have time for questions or answers real quick? Or?
Yeah. Are there any questions? This has been great, Loren. I just want to say this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for... for being my partner here. These things become so much better, like a jazz performance, with questions, because invariably what happens is we walk off and 50 people run up and say, oh, I want to ask you about my cousin. But, it's that interchange with jazz reply. So if you do have a question, we'd love to answer it. Sorry, I don't have time. Okay. But anyway, okay, yes, go ahead.
So I heard it explain that abstract expressionism, one of the things they were trying to do is explore the medium for the sake of the medium. And I'm wondering too, I feel like the same could be said for jazz. Like, you're not displacing the art for that exploration. I'm curious if you have thoughts on that.
Are they displacing the art?
No, I mean, it seems like they're not displacing
Right.
the art, but they're really pushing the medium for the sake of exploring the medium. And I wouldn't say the same is necessarily true of 18th century music.
Oh, I think it is.
Is it?
I think it is. The difference is the self-conscious artist. I mean, those people in those days, the king or the prince had to like what they were doing. That's who paid them. There was no independent artist out there saying, I'm a great artist, and and in his community, no, it was you work for Prince whomever, or the Queen, or somebody, you.
And were they stretching the limits of their tools to create that experience, or?
I think so. I think so. I
mean, I think the artists were definitely trying to, at this point, really express themselves in new ways by diving in, as you said, to the mediums.
But this comes back, actually maybe it's a nice place to start to wrap up, which is that we talked about that this painting was in someone's house for many years. And you know what? Maybe that's a wonderful thing. Maybe the only way that you can really get to know a painting, I know that I have 2 little paintings that I bought in my house by an artist who I met through Lee Bell, actually a guy named Al Kresh, and it's the only thing I have. But anyway, what's the point? They've been in my living room now for years and years, for decades. And I experience them and know them in a way that I'll never know all the great paintings of the world that I've seen. And in a sense, like jazz has become non-functional, in the sense of like people don't dance to it anymore. People don't laugh to it anymore. You're not supposed to eat to it. You go to a jazz club and you read rules, you know what I mean? Which, I'm a musician, I understand it. Do I want somebody talking when I'm playing? Well, maybe I do, I don't know. Maybe I should be confident enough that they paid money to come in, I have to pay my rent, so I'm happy they came in. They chose to talk, I can shush them if I want, but so what's the point? The point is that art, all that great art of the world, the Goldberg variations by Bach, right? I mean, they were written for a count and played by his pianist named Goldberg, because the guy couldn't sleep. And you say, play me the variations. And as silly as it sounds, the functional sense of art, of having a painting like this in your house, you live with it. Your kids grow up to it. You wake up to it, you go to sleep to it. And maybe there's something to be said for that. And maybe there's something to be said for jazz also, in a way, coming back to a personal function. And this is maybe one of the prices that we pay for turning things into high art. It's, that there's a price you pay. There's a price you pay. And Lord knows, again, but this is a welcoming environment. This museum is not a pressure place, I don't know how to describe it. It's a relaxed environment. But we all know that the great majority of places you go to, they are pressure-like.
Yeah, but I think the hope here at the Anderson Collection at Stanford University is that it does reflect the way in which the Andersons live with this.
That's what I'm saying.
Home for 50 years.
This is their home.
And this is
in a sense,
home of
right?
This work and other works that come and to be shared and shared and explored here.
Yes.
And I think accessibility is one of our major goals here and one of the major missions.
Right.
As is making connections outside of the painting and sculpture world, right? To jazz, to performance, to dance, to theater. And we're hoping that, this talk is one of many things like it to come, so that there is this holistic understanding of what happened at this time in America and beyond.
And at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, frankly, we're trying to take a page out of your book, which is how do you have a museum built around something with these qualities and yet not rob it of the quality, but there must be a museum for it. Of course there must be.
Yeah, and there are always enhancements possible.
Right.
So we're working to make sure that these types of dialogues continue.
Are you thinking about having music played here at the museum when people look at the paintings?
Yeah, we're working on some of that. We've had a few opportunities to do it so far. In the early days, actually, we did a a joint open house with Stanford Live. And we had some jazz musicians. That day particularly, I think it was only outside. But then later, we had some student groups who were performing in the galleries or in areas of the galleries. Some of them were just playing, others were accompanying performers, dancers. So things like that will come. So yeah, keep an eye out on the website. I'm sure he could. I'm sure he could.
Sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
Behind you, there was another question?
But very quickly,
Yes.
you know, because of the phrase of giving meaning to the moment,
Right.
and throughout the talk I saw there was the deliberated action, the mind in it, and yet this spontaneity, the unmind, and there was the emotion, the physicality, and in my mind it kind of, I'm thinking, oh, I wish there was a talk about the philosophical influences on, because it almost sounds Zen.
Yeah. What
Maybe we're putting that on these artists.
Why not?
Yeah.
It's in the eye of the beholder, on the mind of the beholder. You know?
That's right.
Yeah, yeah.
There's one more. Yes.
It's possible to hear this good traditional jazz music right now in the environment you're thinking of. Casual, you can eat a meal, you can drink your wine up here, whatever you want. No min, no cover. Come on and listen on Friday nights. Go down to Cafe Baroni right over here.
Oh, great.
I got hooked in this trad jazz 62 years ago as a student right here at Stanford University, and I've been hooked ever since. I don't play. I just tap on 1 and 3, clap on 2 and 4.
That's great.
But come down and that band, by the way, and all on the walls right now at Cafe Baroni. This would be of interest to you. William Carter, also a student.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Has his pictures that he's taken of trad jazz musicians throughout the world. One that I really like is, visualize this. Louis Armstrong down in that lower right-hand corner, pointing his trumpet up to a spotlight at the upper right-hand side, and the rest of the thing is black. But this is a beautiful picture of Louis Armstrong, and other pictures there of really good. So come down and enjoy. This music is being played. By the way, I just want to say one other thing. Last night I heard Bob Schultz, who played for Turk Murphy for 10 years, and his band play, and by mistake, these two guys that can play both tuba and trombone, both came with their tubas. That was the first time I've ever heard a true tuba jazz band, and what was so, these guys are real musicians. They just took it in, and they just moved with it. And
Thank you, Mr. Baroni.
They just
Okay.
and the other guy has it. It's good.
Well, on that, thank you very much. Thank you. That was great. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's the only question.